Grandma Martha had always been the heart of Clearwater, a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other's names and stories. In her younger years, she had run a cozy little bakery on Main Street, filling the town with the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh bread. After her husband passed away, Martha poured her love and energy into the community, baking for town events and organizing small gatherings at the church. She was loved by everyone, or so she thought. Martha's family, however, had slowly drifted away. Her son and his family would visit occasionally, but it became clear that these visits were more out of obligation than genuine interest. Still, Martha would cook her famous pot roast and set the table with care each time they promised to come. She had grown accustomed to them arriving late, often offering excuses about work or school, but she held on to every moment she had with them, hoping that each visit would bring them closer. Her heart ached each time they left, but she'd learned to mask her loneliness with a warm smile and kind words. One frigid winter evening, Martha found herself preparing again. Snow blanketed the streets outside, transforming Clearwater into a winter wonderland. She knew her grandchildren loved the snow, so she set out their favorite hot chocolate mugs on the counter, with marshmallows piled high and a sprinkle of cocoa powder. Her cozy home was filled with the smell of the freshly baked cookies she knew they adored. She glanced at the clock, noting they were already an hour late. Her mind raced through familiar justifications. Maybe they got caught in traffic, or maybe the snow had slowed them down. Despite the creeping sense of disappointment, she held on to hope, lighting a candle in the window to guide them through the cold. When she finally heard the crunch of tires in the snow, her heart leaped with joy. She hurried to the door, eagerly opening it to greet her family. But something seemed off. Her son was in the car, his eyes focused elsewhere, while her grandchildren barely glanced in her direction. One of them muttered something about just running in for a second. They looked distracted, shivering as they complained about the cold, barely acknowledging the warmth she had prepared for them. Her eldest grandson, Tommy, sighed heavily, muttering about how he just wanted to get this over with. Martha tried to brush it off, determined to make the most of their short visit. She called them into the house, her voice warm and inviting, but they stayed on the porch, glancing back at the car, clearly in a hurry to leave. When she reached out to embrace them, they stepped back, mumbling a quick goodbye before retreating to the car. And before she knew it, the doors slammed shut, and the car engine roared to life. She barely had a moment to process it before she found herself alone on the icy porch, the cold air biting into her skin. She waited, hoping they would turn back, that it was all some kind of mistake. But the taillights of the car disappeared into the distance, leaving her standing there, shivering in the dark. The snow swirled around her, sticking to her hair and clothes as the biting wind clawed at her exposed skin. Her breath came out in short, visible puffs, and she could feel the chill seeping into her bones. She looked around, disoriented and hurt. The house was a mere 5 steps away, but the weight of their abandonment made each step feel impossibly heavy. For a few moments, she considered waiting outside, hoping they'd come back to apologize. But as the minutes passed and the cold became unbearable, she realized the painful truth. They weren't coming back. With a deep breath, she steadied herself and turned toward the house, opening the door with hands that trembled not only from the cold, but from the hurt that settled deep within her heart. Inside, the house felt empty, silent. The hot chocolate she'd prepared had gone cold, and the cookies, once warm and inviting, seemed now to be a bitter reminder of her isolation. Martha sank into her favorite chair, feeling a profound loneliness, unlike any she had felt before. She thought of all the times she had gone out of her way to be there for her family, even when they didn't seem to notice or care. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she brushed them away, trying to hold on to her pride. This was her family. She had loved them unconditionally, given them her best. But tonight, something inside her shifted. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted to all the other elderly residents in Clearwater who might be feeling just as isolated, overlooked by the very families they had spent a lifetime caring for. In that quiet, cold night, Martha made a decision she never thought she'd make. She would no longer be a silent, patient figure, waiting for their crumbs of affection. She would live for herself, find her own joy, and maybe, just maybe, start making friends outside of her family. This night, filled with bitterness and cold, had ignited something new in her. In the quiet days that followed, Martha found herself reflecting on the years she had spent as the dependable grandmother, the one who never asked for anything, and was always ready with a warm meal, a smile, and an open heart. It had been her role in the family for as long as she could remember, and she wore it like a badge of honor. She was there for birthdays, graduations, holidays, and even the ordinary days that nobody else remembered, always giving, always patient, even as she watched her family's visits become less and less frequent, reduced to rushed holidays and quick Sunday stops when they had time. They had moved away in increments, small distances at first, just on the other side of town, then one move further out, until she could only expect to see them on major occasions or as an obligation they couldn't avoid. After her husband's death, her son had promised to take care of her, to make sure she was never alone. He told her it was what Dad would have wanted, and for a while, he meant it. But then life got in the way. Her son had a family of his own, a demanding job, and friends who filled up the rest of his time. She knew he loved her, but it was a passive kind of love, one that didn't take much effort or thought. She had hoped things would be different with her grandchildren, that they would see her not as an obligation, but as a part of their lives they cherish. But as they grew older, their visits too had dwindled, and the laughter and warmth she once took for granted were fading into memories. The night they left her in the cold lingered in her mind like a bruise, tender to the touch and impossible to ignore. It was a night that seemed to break through her habitual patience and acceptance, forcing her to confront the emptiness she had been pretending not to see. For the first time, Martha allowed herself to feel the anger and hurt she had been bottling up for years. She found herself staring at the walls of her home, at the pictures of her family that lined the shelves, wondering if she had been clinging to an illusion of love and closeness that wasn't real. She wondered if she had sacrificed too much, had given them too much room to take her for granted. As the days passed, Martha started to pull away from that familiar routine. She no longer set the table in expectation of her family's visits. She stopped preparing big meals on Sunday, no longer assuming that anyone would come. For the first time in years, she was beginning to take back her own space, her own time. It was a strange feeling, almost foreign to her, and yet there was a quiet power in it. She was no longer at the mercy of their schedules and whims, waiting for scraps of affection. She could feel herself changing, her heart hardening a little, and while part of her grieved that loss of innocence, another part of her felt a new strength rising up. Martha's withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Her neighbors, some of whom had known her for decades, noticed that she was no longer as cheerful as she once was. They saw her walking alone in the evenings, her head bent down as if lost in thought, no longer waving to passers-by with her usual warmth. Word began to spread quietly through the town that something had happened to Martha, though nobody knew quite what. A few of her old friends stopped by to check on her, to see if she needed anything, but Martha, proud as ever, assured them she was fine, brushing off their concerns with polite smiles and brief conversations. One day, a close friend named Edna, who had known Martha since their school days, finally got her to open up. Edna was persistent, not taking no for an answer. And eventually, Martha broke down and told her the whole story. She told her about the cold night, the waiting, and the realization that her family had left her behind not only physically but emotionally. Edna listened in silence, her face a mixture of sadness and anger on Martha's behalf. She reached out and squeezed Martha's hand, whispering, "You deserve better than that." It was a simple phrase, but it struck a deep chord in Martha. No one had ever told her that before, that she deserved better. She had spent her whole life believing it was her role to give and expect nothing in return, to love without asking for anything back. Hearing Edna say those words felt like a revelation, a permission she had never given herself. With Edna's encouragement, Martha began to reach out to the community in ways she hadn't before. She volunteered at the local library, teaching young children to read, and joined a group that helped organize events for Clearwater's elderly residents. She found herself surrounded by people who valued her presence, who appreciated her wisdom and kindness. She made new friends, people who looked forward to her company, who laughed with her and shared stories. She was discovering a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years, one that wasn't tied to her family or her role as a mother and grandmother. One afternoon, as she was helping to set up a small event for the elderly at the community center, she overheard two women talking about their own families, about the struggles and disappointments that came with raising children who grew up and drifted away. Their words resonated with her deeply, and for the first time, she felt a kinship with others who shared her pain. She realized she was not alone in this experience, that there were others who, like her, had poured themselves into their families only to be left feeling forgotten and unappreciated. It was a bittersweet comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. As Martha threw herself into this new chapter of her life, her family remained oblivious. Weeks went by without a word from them, and she found she no longer missed their calls or visits. She was creating her own happiness, building a life that wasn't dependent on them. Her heart still ached from time to time, and she wondered if they even noticed her absence, but she pushed those thoughts aside, determined to focus on the people who were present, who truly cared for her. Then, one Sunday, she received an unexpected visit. Her son arrived at her doorstep, looking slightly uncomfortable, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. He had noticed, finally, that she hadn't called or invited them over in a while. He mumbled something about being worried, about how they had missed her usual Sunday dinner, but his words rang hollow to Martha. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that she no longer felt the same longing for his approval or affection. She was no longer willing to be the one who always waited, always gave without question. Instead of welcoming him in with open arms, she invited him to sit on the porch with her, a small but significant boundary. She told him about her new activities, her friends at the community center, and the joy she had found in helping others. She saw the surprise in his eyes, and maybe a flicker of guilt, but she didn't give him a chance to speak. She wanted him to understand that she was no longer the same person he had taken for granted. As he left that evening, he promised to visit more often, to bring the grandchildren around. But Martha, watching him walk away, knew that whether he followed through or not, she would be fine. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from expectations, from the need to be the perfect mother and grandmother. Free to live her own life, on her own terms. And as the sun set over Clearwater, Martha sat on her porch, feeling a quiet peace settle over her, a peace that had been missing for far too long. She was no longer just a grandmother, just a mother. She was Martha, and that was enough. The winter days slowly gave way to an early spring, but the crisp bite of cold still lingered in the air, a stark reminder to Martha of the night she was left alone on her porch. It wasn't a bitter memory anymore. Rather, it was something that empowered her, a symbol of her newfound independence. In the weeks following that night, she built a steady rhythm around her new life. She was no longer just Grandma Martha, waiting by the window for family who often forgot her. She had taken on new roles within her community, becoming someone more than the quiet figure she had once been. Each morning, she woke up early and took a brisk walk through Clearwater, no longer just as a familiar face, but as a newfound friend to many. The people in town began to look forward to her morning greetings and her infectious smile. Her routine walks became a time of quiet reflection as she admired the town she'd lived in for decades, a town she now saw with fresh eyes. She paid attention to small things, the gentle sway of leaves in the breeze, the colorful murals painted on the walls of shops, the joyful laughter of children in the park. These were scenes she had overlooked in her years of waiting for family who rarely came, scenes she now cherished. Martha's days filled up quickly. She volunteered to organize weekly gatherings at the community center, focusing on connecting the town's elderly residents. It started as a simple idea, a weekly tea party where people could come together, share stories, and keep each other company. But word spread fast, and before long, it became one of the most popular events in Clearwater. People who had once felt isolated now had something to look forward to, a place where they felt seen and valued. Martha found herself in her element, baking treats for the gatherings and listening intently to everyone's stories. They shared tales of childhood, memories of lost loves, and anecdotes that brought laughter and sometimes tears. Martha realized that, just like her, many people in Clearwater had quietly borne the burden of loneliness. She had given them a space where they didn't have to pretend anymore. One particular afternoon, a soft-spoken woman named Helen shared a story that stayed with Martha. Helen, frail yet feisty in spirit, confided that her family, much like Martha's, only visited out of a sense of duty. They went through the motions, never fully engaging, treating her more like a relic of the past than a person with hopes and dreams. Helen's story mirrored Martha's own, and as they sat together, Martha reached out and held Helen's hand, a silent promise of solidarity. They didn't need words. They understood each other perfectly. In that moment, Martha realized that her role in the community had become more than she had imagined. She was no longer just helping others. She was building a movement, one that brought people together in their shared experiences and allowed them to reclaim their dignity. The tea gatherings continued to grow, and soon enough, the events became the talk of the town. People of all ages started attending, drawn in by the lively conversations and the heartwarming stories shared. Younger folks began to join in, curious about the past lives of the older generation, eager to learn and understand. It was a small but meaningful shift in Clearwater's culture. Parents brought their children to meet the elderly, encouraging them to sit and listen, to ask questions, and hear firsthand the stories of a time before smartphones and social media. A bridge was forming between generations, and it was built on respect and mutual curiosity. Martha watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride, knowing that she had sparked something important. But as much as Martha found solace in her new connections, the memory of her family's abandonment lingered. It wasn't that she missed them, exactly, but rather that she missed what they represented. The sense of family, the idea of belonging to people who shared her history. She had begun to accept that her own family might never appreciate her in the way she'd hoped, but the pain of their indifference still haunted her. The townspeople, sensing her lingering sadness, became even more attentive to her, filling her life with gestures of kindness and support. Every day, there was someone who invited her to coffee, someone who left flowers on her porch, someone who simply wanted to sit and chat. Martha's heart began to mend, slowly but surely, surrounded by a community that had become her chosen family. Then, one day, a surprising message arrived. A letter from her eldest grandson, Tommy, arrived in her mailbox, the handwriting messy and uneven, but unmistakably his. She hadn't heard from him since that night months ago, when he and his siblings had left her standing in the cold. She opened the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly, a mixture of curiosity and caution in her heart. The letter was brief, and his words were clumsy, but honest. He apologized, admitting he hadn't understood how much his actions had hurt her. He shared that the family had noticed her absence, that Sundays weren't the same without her. Tommy wrote that he missed her, that he was sorry, and that he wanted to make things right. Martha's heart softened as she read his words, but she was cautious. She had made a new life for herself, one that wasn't dependent on their visits or approval. Forgiveness, she realized, was a gift she could give, but it didn't mean she had to return to the way things were. She sat with the letter for days, rereading it in quiet moments, thinking carefully about how she wanted to respond. Finally, she wrote back. Her letter was as warm as ever, filled with the kindness she was known for, but with a firmness that was new to her. She told Tommy that she had forgiven him, that she loved him and his siblings, but that she had changed. She explained that she no longer waited by the window, no longer prepared elaborate meals or lingered in anticipation of their visits. She had a new life now, she wrote, one that fulfilled her. And if they wanted to be a part of it, they would have to respect her independence. She invited him to one of the tea gatherings, an invitation he could accept or ignore, but one that came without expectation. Tommy's response surprised her. Not only did he accept her invitation, but he showed up with his siblings, each of them looking nervous yet determined to make amends. They sat with her at the tea gathering, listening as she introduced them to her new friends, proudly sharing stories about each person's life and contributions. The kids were quiet at first, unsure of how to act around this version of their grandmother, a woman they hadn't taken the time to truly know. But as they listened to the stories and witnessed the respect and love others held for her, they began to see her through different eyes. As the afternoon wore on, Martha's grandchildren opened up, asking questions, genuinely engaging with the older residents. They were captivated by the tales of war, hardship, love, and adventure shared by people who had lived through worlds so different from their own. Martha watched her grandchildren with a swelling pride, feeling that they too were beginning to learn the value of the wisdom and strength that surrounded them. After the gathering, Tommy pulled Martha aside. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of admiration and guilt. "I didn't know, Grandma," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were so amazing." Martha chuckled softly, patting his hand. "Well, now you do," she replied with a gentle smile. "And maybe that's a start." Their relationship didn't mend overnight, but it did begin to heal, slowly and cautiously. They came to visit more often, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to spend time with her, to learn from her, and to understand the person she had become. Martha no longer depended on them, but she welcomed them back into her life with open arms, careful to set boundaries that respected her newfound independence. The people of Clearwater noticed the change in Martha's family, and her story became a quiet legend, an unspoken reminder of the importance of valuing those we love before it's too late. Martha's journey had a ripple effect across the town, inspiring others to reconnect with their families, to reach out to loved ones who might be feeling forgotten. Her strength and resilience had become a guiding light, a reminder that it was never too late to rewrite one's story. In the end, Martha had found not only herself, but a legacy she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just a grandmother waiting by the window. She was a pillar of her community, a friend, and a woman who had turned her loneliness into a force for connection. As spring blossomed around her, she felt a profound peace settle within, knowing that she was loved not out of obligation, but out of choice. Months passed, and the transformation in Martha's life became a story that people in Clearwater spoke about with a sense of admiration and reverence. She had become something of a local legend, a symbol of resilience and strength, not because she had fought against her family, but because she had found a way to flourish despite the pain they had unintentionally caused her. People respected her newfound independence, her spirit that seemed unbreakable despite everything she had endured, and her ability to forgive without sacrificing her dignity. Martha's tea gatherings had taken on a life of their own. Every week, more people showed up, not only from Clearwater but even from neighboring towns, drawn by word of mouth about the unique and heartwarming gathering. The community center was abuzz every Thursday afternoon with laughter, conversation, and the rich aroma of Martha's baked goods. There was an energy there that hadn't existed before, a spark that Martha had ignited, and people looked forward to it as the highlight of their week. It wasn't just tea and biscuits. It was a space of warmth and acceptance, a place where people could share memories and wisdom, feel heard, and belong. There were people from all walks of life, from retirees and widows to young single parents, and even high school students curious to learn from the older generation. Martha noticed that her grandchildren were becoming regulars too. At first, they had only come out of guilt or curiosity, unsure of how to fit into this new world their grandmother had created. But over time, they grew comfortable, finding friends among people they never would have spoken to before. Her oldest grandson, Tommy, often sat with an elderly man named George, a retired teacher who had 1,000 stories about his days spent traveling and teaching across the country. Her granddaughter, Lucy, became fast friends with Helen, the soft-spoken woman whose story of familial neglect had once moved Martha to tears. Lucy and Helen often baked together, sharing recipes and laughter as Helen taught Lucy old tricks she'd learned in her own mother's kitchen. One afternoon, as Martha watched her grandchildren immersed in conversation with her new friends, she felt a deep contentment, a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if she had created something far more significant than a simple tea gathering. She had brought people together in a way that allowed them to feel seen, valued, and respected. It dawned on her that this gathering wasn't just about filling a void in her life. It was about healing and empowering an entire community. Her personal story of abandonment had become a catalyst for something beautiful, something that connected people who had felt alone or forgotten. But even as her life filled with joy and connection, Martha's family remained on the periphery. Her son, still caught up in his demanding job and busy life, occasionally dropped by the tea gatherings to see her and check on the children, but he seemed out of place. He was polite, perhaps even a bit apologetic, but Martha sensed a lingering distance between them, a hesitancy she couldn't quite understand. He seemed to struggle with the woman she had become, a woman who was no longer simply mom or grandma waiting at home, but a force in her community, someone whose influence stretched far beyond the confines of family. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the realization that he had been blind to her potential and worth for so many years. One evening, her son asked to speak to her alone. They sat on her porch, watching the last traces of sunlight fade over Clearwater, the air thick with a quiet tension. He began slowly, stumbling over his words as he confessed his regret for how he had treated her, for how he had let his life take priority over his relationship with her. He admitted that he had underestimated her, that he had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, unchanging and patient, in the background of his life. He acknowledged that he had never truly seen her as a person with dreams, needs, and feelings beyond her role as his mother. Martha listened quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, her face calm and unreadable. She had waited a long time for these words, and as she heard them, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She told him that she forgave him, but that she had moved on, had built a life that was fulfilling without needing to be centered around his visits. She didn't say this to hurt him, but to help him understand that she was not the same woman he had left standing on the porch that night. She was Martha now, fully herself, a person with her own purpose and a community that valued her for who she was. Her son nodded, and for a moment, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows over the quiet streets, and for the first time, he seemed to see her as a person rather than just his mother. She hoped he would carry that new understanding forward, not just with her but with others in his life. She hoped he would remember this moment, the way she had reclaimed her dignity and independence, and that he would never again take someone's love and patience for granted. Over the next few weeks, Martha began to notice subtle changes in him. He started showing up more frequently, not just to drop off the children, but to stay and listen to her stories, to help her with tasks she'd once handled alone. He brought small gifts, flowers, a basket of fresh apples, her favorite tea, gestures that showed he was trying to make amends in his own way. Martha welcomed him, but she remained firm in her boundaries. She didn't let him slip back into the habit of taking her time for granted. She had built something valuable, something that gave her life meaning, and she wasn't willing to sacrifice that for anyone, not even her own son. Meanwhile, the tea gatherings continued to grow, drawing people from farther away, becoming a fixture in the lives of those who attended. Martha began to hear stories of families reconnecting, of people reaching out to elderly relatives they had forgotten or overlooked. The gatherings became more than just a community event. They became a symbol of renewal, a reminder that it was never too late to make amends, to find connection, and to value the people who had been there all along. Inspired by the gatherings, the town council decided to create a new initiative, a program dedicated to honoring and supporting the elderly in Clearwater. They called it Martha's Circle, a nod to the woman who had brought them together, and established it as a series of events, services, and support networks aimed at ensuring that no one in Clearwater would feel forgotten or left behind. Martha was invited to the launch event, where she was honored with a plaque and heartfelt speeches from community leaders, friends, and even her grandchildren, who shared how much they had learned from her strength and resilience. She listened quietly, her heart full as each person spoke, their words painting a picture of the impact she had made. She couldn't help but smile as she watched her grandchildren stand beside her, proudly introducing her to others as not just their grandmother, but a role model and a friend. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment, a certainty that her life had meant something, that she had created a legacy far beyond what she had ever imagined. As the evening wore on, Martha took a moment to step outside, away from the noise and the crowd, to look out over Clearwater, the town she had called home for so many years. The stars twinkled overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, filling her with a sense of peace. She thought about the journey she had been on, the pain and loneliness she had once felt, and how it had led her to this moment, surrounded by people who loved and respected her for who she truly was. In that quiet moment, she whispered a silent thank you to her husband, to her friends, to the town, and even to her family, who had unknowingly pushed her to find her own strength. She was grateful for every challenge, every heartbreak, because it had led her to a life filled with purpose and joy. And as she stood there, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, Martha knew that she was no longer defined by anyone else's expectations or limitations. She was free, in every sense of the word, a woman who had carved out her own place in the world and in the hearts of all who knew her. Martha's life had become a beautiful tapestry of connections, purpose, and fulfillment. Each thread woven into her daily routine represented a life she had touched or been touched by, a friendship that brought color to her world, or a family bond that, despite its imperfections, continued to grow stronger. The Martha's Circle initiative gained momentum quickly, and soon the gatherings became a core part of Clearwater's culture, a symbol of unity and resilience. The town had taken on a new vibrancy, one that everyone could feel in the very atmosphere, a sense of community that was both rare and precious. As weeks turned into months, Martha's role in the community deepened. She was invited to speak at local events, to share her journey and insights with others. She attended town hall meetings, where her opinion was not only respected but actively sought out. People wanted to hear from the woman who had managed to transform her personal struggles into a catalyst for change. At first, Martha had been hesitant to accept these roles, preferring to stay in the background, content with the quiet impact of her tea gatherings. But with the encouragement of her friends and family, she eventually stepped forward, finding her voice and sharing her wisdom with a wider audience. One Saturday afternoon, Martha found herself in the middle of a town meeting where a heated debate was unfolding. The topic was a proposed community center expansion that would include more activities and resources for Clearwater's elderly residents, as well as programs to foster interactions between generations. While most people supported the idea, there were a few who saw it as an unnecessary expense, something that could be put off until the town had more pressing matters addressed. Martha listened quietly, her hands clasped in her lap as the voices around her grew louder, each side arguing passionately. Finally, someone turned to her, and the room fell silent. Martha felt the weight of their expectations, the hopes of those who believed in her vision, and the skepticism of those who questioned it. Taking a deep breath, she rose from her seat, her calm presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She spoke simply, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She reminded them of the night she had been left out in the cold, of the loneliness that had once threatened to consume her. She shared how she had found strength not in isolation, but in connection, in the bonds she had formed with the people of Clearwater. She described the power of unity, the importance of supporting each other, especially the elderly who had given so much to the town over the years. The room was silent as she spoke, each word resonating deeply with those who listened. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, and the vote for the expansion passed unanimously. Martha returned to her seat, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment, knowing she had used her voice to make a difference. As the meeting ended, people came up to her, offering their thanks, expressing how much her words had meant to them. Among them was her son, who had been sitting quietly in the back. He embraced her, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, Mom." It was a moment she would cherish forever, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on, a journey that had brought them closer in ways she never could have imagined. Martha's influence continued to ripple through the town. The Martha's Circle program expanded beyond just tea gatherings. It grew to include mentorship opportunities, where younger members of the community could learn skills from their elders, from cooking and gardening to storytelling and crafting. The gatherings became a place of learning and mutual respect, a hub where wisdom and experience were valued and passed down. Young people who had once seen the elderly as distant figures began to see them as friends and mentors, people with rich histories and valuable knowledge to share. Martha watched with quiet pride as her vision unfolded, as Clearwater became a place where people of all ages could feel connected, where no one felt forgotten or left behind. One day, as Martha was preparing for another gathering, a young woman named Sarah approached her with an unusual request. Sarah, a local journalist, had been following Martha's journey and was fascinated by her story. She asked if she could write a feature about Martha, not just about the tea gatherings, but about her entire life, her resilience, and the impact she had made on the town. Martha hesitated at first. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and she didn't think her story was particularly extraordinary. But Sarah was persistent, explaining that Martha's journey could inspire others, that people everywhere needed to hear about the power of resilience and the importance of community. After some thought, Martha agreed, and over the next few weeks, she sat down with Sarah, sharing memories, reflections, and lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke about her marriage, her years running the bakery, the joy and sorrow of raising a family, and the night she had been left in the cold, a night that had changed everything. As she spoke, Martha realized just how much she had grown, how each painful experience had shaped her into the person she was now. She found herself revisiting memories she hadn't thought about in years, moments of both joy and heartbreak that had defined her journey. When the article was published, it received an overwhelming response. People from all over wrote letters, some sharing their own stories of loneliness and resilience, others expressing gratitude for the inspiration Martha had provided. The story even attracted attention from a regional news station, which asked if they could feature Martha and the Martha's Circle initiative on their program. Suddenly, Martha found herself in a new kind of spotlight, one she had never anticipated but accepted with grace and humility. She realized that her story had become something larger than herself, a beacon of hope for others who had felt alone or forgotten. As the attention grew, so did the impact of her work. Donations poured in from people who wanted to support the community center's expansion, ensuring that Clearwater's elderly residents would always have a place to gather, to share stories, to feel connected. Other towns began reaching out, asking for advice on how they could start similar programs. Martha spent hours on the phone with people she had never met, offering guidance and encouragement, helping them build their own communities of support and connection. In the midst of all this, Martha's family continued to grow closer. Her son began to take an active role in Martha's Circle, helping to coordinate events and even volunteering to lead a few gatherings himself. He admitted to her one day, in a quiet moment of vulnerability, that he had always struggled with understanding her, with reconciling the roles of mother and individual that she embodied. He had been blinded by his own life, his own ambitions, and he hadn't seen the woman she truly was. But now, as he stood by her side, he saw her clearly, not just as his mother, but as a remarkable woman whose strength and compassion had changed an entire town. Their relationship, once strained and distant, had deepened into something more honest, more real. Martha's grandchildren, too, had transformed. They no longer saw their visits as obligations, but as opportunities to learn and connect. They began bringing their friends to the gatherings, sharing the lessons they had learned from her with others their age. They had grown into compassionate young adults, deeply aware of the importance of family, community, and respect for those who had come before them. They often spoke about how their grandmother's journey had shaped them, teaching them the value of resilience, the importance of kindness, and the power of connection. As Martha looked around at the life she had built, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had found a purpose that went beyond herself, a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. She knew that Clearwater was stronger now, that the bonds she had helped to forge would continue to grow, carrying her story forward into future generations. She had taken what was once a moment of pain and turned it into a movement of love and unity, something that would continue to impact lives long after she was gone. In one of her final journal entries, Martha wrote, "I thought I was forgotten, that my time had passed. But I have learned that life has a way of surprising us, of showing us that we are never truly alone. We are all connected, bound by our shared experiences, our need for love, our hope for understanding. I have lived a full life, and I am grateful for every moment, every heartache, every joy. I only hope that my story reminds others that they, too, are seen, that they matter, and that it's never too late to find purpose and connection." And so, as the years went by, Martha's Circle became a permanent fixture in Clearwater, a testament to the strength and resilience of one woman who had turned her pain into a legacy of love. Her story lived on in the hearts of all who knew her, a reminder that even the darkest nights can give birth to the brightest mornings, and that true strength is found not in isolation but in connection, in the simple act of reaching out and letting others in. Years passed, and Martha's impact on Clearwater continued to grow in ways that she herself could have never anticipated. The legacy of Martha's Circle became woven into the very fabric of the town, with her story inspiring not just the elderly but people of all ages and backgrounds. As Martha entered her late 80s, her energy slowed, but her spirit remained unbroken, her mind sharp and engaged with the lives around her. She had become more than just an individual in the community. She was a symbol of resilience, kindness, and the power of transformation. Clearwater had changed because of her. The community center was now a bustling hub of activity, a place where people gathered not just to socialize, but to learn, grow, and support one another. Young people held workshops there, offering to teach technology skills to older residents, while the elders shared skills in sewing, gardening, and cooking with a younger generation hungry to learn from their wisdom. Local artists painted murals on the center's walls, depicting scenes of Clearwater's history, including one of Martha surrounded by people of all ages, a tribute to the woman who had helped build such a vibrant, interconnected community. The town had expanded the Martha's Circle program far beyond what it once was. With her blessing, they created a mentorship program, pairing young people with older residents to encourage mutual learning and friendship. They held annual storytelling festivals where people would gather to share tales of their lives, preserving their histories and passing down stories that might have otherwise been forgotten. The town's archives began recording these gatherings, creating an oral history that would be accessible for generations. Martha would often sit in on these sessions, listening with a smile as people shared their experiences. She would contribute her own stories, recounting her life's journey, her marriage, the struggles and triumphs of raising a family, and the transformation she'd undergone after that cold night on her porch. Each story was told not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to that present moment. As Martha approached her 90th birthday, her family decided to throw a grand celebration in her honor, inviting not only relatives but also friends, neighbors, and members of the community who had become a part of her life through the years. Preparations began months in advance, with townspeople eagerly volunteering to help. They transformed the community center into a beautiful venue, decorated with flowers and banners, each handmade by residents who had been touched by Martha's kindness. There was a display of photographs chronicling her life, from her days as a young woman in love, through the years she spent raising a family, to recent pictures of her at the gathering she had so lovingly organized. On the day of the celebration, people from all across the region arrived to honor Martha. There were speeches from friends and family, each recounting moments when her kindness, wisdom, or resilience had changed their lives. Her grandchildren spoke with deep emotion, sharing how they had learned invaluable lessons from her. Lessons of patience, forgiveness, and the importance of valuing each person's story. Her son stood before the crowd, his voice choked with emotion as he spoke of his pride in his mother, acknowledging the strength she had shown and the lessons she had taught him through her actions. Martha listened with a heart full of love, overwhelmed by the expressions of gratitude and admiration. She hadn't sought out this legacy. It had simply grown from her desire to create a life of meaning and connection. Yet here she was, surrounded by a community that saw her not as an obligation, but as a beloved friend and mentor. She felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at the faces gathered, faces she had come to know and cherish over the years. As the evening went on, Martha found herself surrounded by friends, young and old, each wanting to share a moment, a story, a thank you. She listened, her heart swelling with gratitude for each kind word, each expression of appreciation. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that her life had mattered, that she had left a mark on the world that would endure long after she was gone. She thought back to that cold night so many years ago, the moment that had seemed so painful and isolating, and realized how it had been the spark that had ignited this incredible journey. Then, as the evening wound down, the townspeople unveiled a surprise. They had erected a bench in the center of town, near a beautiful garden that had been planted and tended by volunteers, a place filled with vibrant flowers, lush greenery, and a small fountain that trickled softly, lending an air of peace to the space. On the bench was a plaque, engraved with her name, and the words, "In honor of Martha, who taught us all to cherish each moment and each other." The garden had been dedicated as Martha's Garden, a place for reflection, rest, and community, a lasting reminder of the values she had instilled in Clearwater. The crowd gathered around the bench, and Martha, with help from her son and grandchildren, slowly walked over to it, her hand tracing the words on the plaque. She sat down, taking in the beauty of the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the evening breeze. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, knowing that she had helped create a space that would serve as a sanctuary for people to gather, to heal, and to connect, just as she had done through her gatherings. As people joined her in the garden, she invited them to sit, to share stories, to laugh and reminisce. She encouraged them to talk about their dreams, their families, their hopes for the future. She wanted them to feel that this space was theirs, a place to be open and vulnerable, to find comfort and companionship. She watched as people began to mingle, children running among the flowers, friends exchanging quiet words, families embracing. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled her with joy and pride. The years that followed were quieter for Martha. She spent most of her time at Martha's Garden, welcoming anyone who wanted to join her for a chat or simply sit in companionable silence. She continued to attend the tea gatherings, though she let others take on leadership roles, encouraging the younger members of the community to carry on her vision. She watched with a peaceful heart as they did so, proud to see that her legacy was in good hands. As her health began to wane, her family and friends rallied around her, making sure she was never alone. She spent her days surrounded by love, her home filled with laughter and warmth. Her son and grandchildren visited often, their bond stronger than it had ever been. They would sit by her side, sharing stories of their own lives, their dreams and achievements, grateful for the love and wisdom she had given them. In her final days, Martha was at peace, surrounded by the people she loved and who loved her in return. She knew that her life had been full, that she had given her best to the world, and that her legacy would continue to thrive in the hearts of those she had touched. Her final moments were spent in quiet reflection, a gentle smile on her lips as she looked out the window at the garden that bore her name, the flowers blooming vibrantly in the sunlight. When Martha passed, the town mourned deeply. They came together, just as she had taught them to share memories, to support one another, to celebrate a life that had been rich with love and purpose. At her memorial, people shared stories of how she had touched their lives, how her kindness had inspired them to be better, how her resilience had taught them to keep going even in the face of hardship. Her family spoke of her with reverence, her grandchildren pledging to carry on her values, to honor her legacy by living lives of kindness, empathy, and connection. In the years that followed, Martha's Garden became a place of pilgrimage for people from all over, a place where people came to find solace, to reflect, and to connect with others. The tea gatherings continued, led by new generations who kept Martha's spirit alive, ensuring that her vision of unity and community endured. The bench in the garden remained a cherished spot, a place where people would sit and think about her life, her story, her legacy. Martha's impact on Clearwater continued to grow, a quiet but powerful force that shaped the town for generations to come. Her story was shared and retold, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that transformed lives. She had shown them all that a single person, guided by love and resilience, could change the world around them. And in the end, Martha's legacy was more than a community center, more than a program or a garden. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of compassion and connection, a reminder that we are all bound together, each of us capable of making the world a better place. Her life had been a gift, and as long as people gathered, shared stories, and cared for one another, her spirit would live on, a beacon of hope in a world that would forever be brighter because she had been a part of it.